I'm Kobe Nelson, and this is the Teacher Sphere. Today's conversation is about discovery, both the discoveries Shannon made about her students when she integrated poetry and visual art into her civil discourse instruction, and the discoveries her students made about themselves. As a seasoned teacher, working with everyone from honor students to multilingual learners, Shannon wasn't naturally drawn to teaching with poetry or art. But when she stepped outside her comfort zone and began using these creative mediums alongside the AWARE framework, something remarkable happened. Students who had never shared their thoughts began writing daily poems. More reserved learners started leading discussions. And an entire classroom learned that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. So I'm excited today to have Shannon Edwards here. And we are going to be talking about the ways that she uses poetry and art to empower student voices. Shannon, welcome.
Thank you, Kobe.
So glad you're here. I'm wondering if you could, first of all, just introduce yourself, talk about the grades that you are teaching, have taught, the content area you teach, and then give us a little bit of background about your classroom and your use of poetry and art recently.
Well, thanks, Kobe. I have been teaching this is going to be year 20 for me. It's hard to believe. I have taught high school for all of that time, 9th and 10th grade mostly, and anything from honors. I had 3 sections of honors English 1 last year, and I had one class that was a CWC, so I had some students with special needs and IEPs, and then I had 2 classes of Sheltered English 2 for my ESL students. So high population of English language learners in my building, a lot of students with language difficulties of various levels, whether those are processing issues or just second language, language adaptation issues. So a lot of different language needs in my classes.
For sure. That sounds like a challenge, and I'm curious, what drew you to poetry and art as vehicles in particular for empowering student voices as you were working with students who are learning English as a second language or third language?
It's kind of interesting because neither poetry nor art are really natural mediums for me. I've never felt particularly confident with either one. And so there were a few times that I asked myself, what made you choose this? But the students really responded to the artwork and poetry in ways that I didn't expect. And I really started thinking about how often we see poetry and artwork from more marginalized voices, people that we don't really hear from in our mainstream curriculum. And that really appealed to my students, especially since I have so many students from different cultures and that represent so much diversity. It was just really nice to have so many different voices to choose from.
For sure. I can see that. I'm wondering, how did that set the stage for civil discourse in your class?
When I started civil discourse in my class, I actually made a few mistakes by getting a little bit too personal. Questions that I thought were pretty basic. Who do you most admire? What is really important to you? What's something that you value? I didn't think that those were personal questions, but the students were not having it. But then when we were talking about art and poetry, it kind of lowered that affective filter, I would say. It really caused enough separation from personal feelings that we were able to have some disagreements. And so one of the things that I really had an epiphany, we were talking about landscapes, and I was showing some landscape pictures, and it was some really simple questions. How many of you would like this place? How many of you would not like this place? What are some reasons someone would enjoy this place? And it really just opened up the area for disagreement, made it more comfortable for students.
And that's really fascinating. Do you think that, the fact that it was visual and kind of provided a medium or a way into the conversation that maybe other things wouldn't necessarily, like reading a text or that kind of a thing?
Oh, absolutely. And so many of my students really struggle with reading. And as an English teacher, I don't want that to get in the way of them being able to communicate ideas. So even though some of the text can be high level, and I'm not saying we're not going to read, obviously it's English class and the text is always going to be important. But as you mentioned, that access point of getting them to use the academic language, getting them used to exploring that type of thinking, the art does provide an access point. So many kids are visual. So as I mentioned before, I'm not a visual person and it wasn't natural for me at first, but so many of my kids are visual. And it really did make a difference, particularly for those kids that have some language issues, but even some of the kids that don't have difficulty with language and just really like art. Because there are quite a few students that, hard for me to believe, do not like English and do not like stories. And so some of those students really liked being able to have high-level discussions about different things like artwork.
I have seen that happen in my own classroom as well, art being such a vehicle for students or a way for students to enter the conversation. I'm wondering if we can get a little more specific, like, can you walk us through what happens when you show a piece of visual art, either alongside a poem or a piece of text? And, how does that multimodal approach, how does it create different entry points for different students?
So one thing that I've noticed is that for some students that maybe do struggle with reading, they can analyze art or music at a pretty high level. And music's just another form of poetry. They can notice symbols and themes and important things about character that they might miss in a piece of literature. And so one rewarding thing about this work is that the kids really can do higher level thinking when they have a medium that's accessible for them. And they can notice a lot of different things. And specifically, I would say, when I'm taking them through a piece of art or poem, I get them to focus on what they observe first. And that's the step that a lot of the kids want to skip over, which I was a little surprised by, because to me, it seems the easiest, but it's also one of the most important. So often you've got to really slow them down for that. And whether we're listening to a speech, we're looking at a piece of art, we're watching a slam poem or reading a poem, it's what do you notice? What stands out? What seems to be important? What patterns do you notice? It just really focusing on the observations and not making any judgment, just this is what I notice, and not trying to qualify stuff right at the beginning. So that would be really the opening of it, is getting them used to just observing before making any judgment. And then the next would be really considering the perspective of other people. Who created this piece? How do I think they felt? Why do I think they felt that way? What purpose did they have behind it? That's where you can get into some really interesting discussions with students.
Yes, I can definitely see that. And especially with the new materials that you've created for Sphere, which is using the AWARE framework to teach poetry. And I can see as you're talking, you're really kind of talking about the A and the W there. Right? So
Right.
Observing and then wondering about other people. So we've got the A and the W for AWARE, and I'm wondering if you could talk more about the role of the AWARE framework in this process.
The AWARE, I became just surprised by its adaptability and how often I can use it. As a teachers, we're always searching for those evergreen lessons, right? The things that we can use over and over that don't get stale. And I would have to say it took some adjusting, but AWARE has become one of those evergreen things for me because I really have used it for so many things. So there are actually 5 steps. Doesn't sound like a lot, but you can't really go into depth every single lesson with all 5 steps with AWARE. I just would not recommend that approach. And so I have found with AWARE is that you can really emphasize different stages of the AWARE depending on the standards that you're wanting to assess. And so sometimes I go through that accept and wonder and establish very informally. It might be 5 to 10 minutes of an informal class discussion. Hey, shout out. What do we notice? Oh, you noticed this. I noticed that. Other times, if I want to assess claims, evidence, and reasoning, I might have them make a claim about what they see, or notice, and then use specific details to support that claim and take a little bit longer.
So I hear that giving students space and time is really important, as well as having somewhat of a structured protocol. Does that sound right? How does having a structured approach to discussion, how does it affect students' abilities to enter the conversation and share their thoughts?
The structure with AWARE really helps build confidence, and it helps kids organize their ideas. So we know from any public forum that the people that speak the loudest and speak the most are not always the people with good ideas. So good ideas take time to organize, they take time to develop, and AWARE gives them the space for that time. I was really surprised by how much I could level AWARE. I use standards referenced grading in my classes. And so I consider 3 to be meeting the standard, 4 to be exceeding the standard. Well, I always have concerns with any graphic organizer about limiting kids to that 2 level, really restricting that higher order thinking when I give them a structure. And AWARE did not do that. I did use sentence frames for some of the kids that are still acquiring English or have some processing issues, but not every kid needed the sentence frames. Some kids used AWARE for light note-taking. They wrote bullet points, they wrote rough ideas, lists and charts, and it was fine. My honors kids, they really wanted to take AWARE to the next level and answer the questions in depth and write sentences and paragraphs, and that was great too. So I did like the adaptability of AWARE and that it really did give kids those different access points. I did make visuals for my classroom because I felt like it was just so helpful to be able to refer to AWARE, even if you're just talking to the steps a few minutes each step, when you're introducing a new topic, just to really reinforce those different levels of thinking, those different approaches.
In that vein, how does using AWARE and referring to AWARE, throughout the lesson, how does it help students who prefer maybe different ways of communicating? So let's say like writing or speaking, maybe students who need more processing time. How does it help them contribute meaningfully to the discussion? Whereas in, just kind of a format where you're like, ready, go, discuss, that wouldn't work as well.
Yes, I used to use a lot of ready, go, discuss because that tends to be how I process things. And it is honestly cruel to our ESL kids because often the conversation has moved on to another topic before they've even had time to contribute. And so making everyone stop and think about each step of the AWARE, and even having discussing the different stages, in small groups with a partner, then whole class, slowing everyone down, really gives those students a chance to gather their thoughts. And it does prevent those few students who process really quickly from dominating the conversation.
That's interesting. I'm wondering also about, students who may be moving quicker than students who are maybe taking a little more time to process. How does the AWARE framework, how does it differentiate for them as well? Like, what does it do for them?
I'm glad you asked because sometimes I am afraid that our higher level students get left behind when we talk about scaffolds. And so I do think it's important for those kids who process a little bit faster or go a little bit more depth with the questions to be partnered together so that they have someone at their level who's ready to discuss it roughly the same timeline that they are. And just recognizing that some kids need a little bit more processing time before the conversation and just being a little bit more diligent with your grouping and considerate of your groups.
Can you also expand on that a little bit more when we're thinking about, the AWARE framework? You mentioned that you teach both honors and then you also teach multilingual learners. And I'm curious, within those classes, how do you see the AWARE framework helping each of those students to meet, grade level needs, grade level standards, and those kinds of things?
With the ESOL students, We really did focus on using more sentence frames, obviously, but I was able to incorporate a lot of language and grammar practice in with the Aware and things that seem really simple. But for example, in the Assert, it was always make sure we have proper punctuation of the title and capitalization of the author's name, the little things that students absolutely need to practice that they tend to forget. And so being able to work those things in for ESOL, I was actually surprised with the poetry that even when the language was difficult, the students were able to always fill out at least some parts of the Aware. And that is another thing that both me and the students had to get used to is we don't always start with Assert. We might not be ready to assert. Usually it's good to make observations, but if we want to focus on, hey, I think that the author is feeling this, this is what comes through, I'm going to go straight to wonder, or, hey, I want to know why I'm reading this in the first place. I'm going to go to establish, why are we even looking at this guy? I'm going to read some background on this person. Why is he even writing this poem? Why should I care? So we don't always have to do the steps in order. So I have found it really helpful with ESL to just work in whatever grammar or language practice we need into the Step with Aware. With the honors kids, I really found it helpful for addressing the author's purpose standard. And I find that one to be a tough one, not just looking at what is written, but why somebody wrote it and the way that they're using language, and whether or not they're being effective with their message. That's a tough standard to meet. And I found the Aware, the respect and the establish to actually be really helpful for that. Looking at someone's background, really considering where they're coming from and their purpose on that establish, like always establishing some learning goals and establishing why somebody wrote what they wrote. How do we know that that was their purpose? That was really helpful for those higher level kids.
Can you give me an example of an author that you went through that whole process with your students and how using the Aware framework helped them understand the author's perspective and purpose better?
One of the things that is probably common across a lot of teachers, because it's in a pretty common curriculum, is the Four Freedoms speech by Roosevelt. And the more civics training I attend, the more I just really appreciate the beauty of some of the ideas in that speech and the American values that are being talked about in that speech. But it's also a difficult read for kids. And I've taught it before, and it's a tough one. Even though it's not a really long piece, it's really difficult for kids to digest. And Aware helps break it down into pieces. Let's establish why he is giving this speech. What is happening? What is the background? What are some of his appeals to logic? What are some of where would we fit the appeals to logic? So sometimes even adapting a common curriculum and taking some of the questions from that and saying, okay, where would we answer that on Aware? So the book is asking us this, where does it fit on Aware? And I found that to be some of the most helpful lessons. Or if a student made some type of observation, wow, I love that. Where does it fit on our Aware organizer? Where did that go? So that kind of metacognition, kids really actually appreciate that. They like thinking about their own thinking. They appreciate learning about their own learning.
Yeah, they do. I think we all do, to a certain extent. It's always interesting to reflect and to think about, how am I actually thinking about this? And once you kind of open that door for a kid, it's really cool to see, what they come up with, really. We've been talking a lot about the academic ability of students and how valuable the Aware framework is for their academic growth in English language arts in particular, and across a wide swath of students with many different backgrounds. And I would like to talk a little bit more about the affective, side of things, the affective needs of students. And I'm wondering what you saw as you used the Aware framework to teach poetry and you used art. What did you see in students' confidence levels as you implemented these lessons? Did you observe any changes? And if so, can you describe them to us?
I have some real success stories, but without getting too specific, I can say that in general, I had some very, very shy students come out of their shell. When I started civil discourse work with my classes in general, I was taken aback by how many students were uncomfortable sharing their opinions. And teenagers get a reputation so often for being contrary, for being the opposite, right? For being argumentative.
Yeah.
And that's just not the way that it is anymore. And I've seen a marked change over the last 5 years in particular. And for a while, I couldn't quite understand. I thought, maybe afraid of being wrong. Nobody wants that, especially publicly. But it goes a lot deeper. When you look at what's going on in social media or just the media in general, if I thought that the people speaking on TV, that was the opinions of my friends, my neighbors, my community, I'd probably be afraid to share my opinions too. And so I can kind of understand why it's happening. So the assert, which I expected to be the easy part of aware, is actually one of the hardest. So despite the reputation of teenagers, people that work with them know our kids are actually really sweet and they want to be polite and they want to please. And I, more than once, a student said, well, what if we disagree? I said, honey, that's the point. We're having a discussion and, oh, but I don't want to be rude to you, miss. And that took more time than I thought to get past that and to talk about how people are separate from their ideas. There's more to a person than their opinions, that you can disagree with someone's ideas and you're not disagreeing with them as a human being. Like that's okay. And it's the same when someone disagrees with your ideas. They can still accept you as a person and just not agree with something that you're saying. It doesn't mean they think less of you. That took work. That took practice. That's one area where the art was really helpful, is it really lowered that affective filter, and it let us all disagree about something that wasn't personal. One of my favorite statements in class is, I didn't write it. I didn't paint it. You can say whatever you want. It's not going to hurt my feelings. It's fine. But actually, kids do need a lot of practice getting comfortable with the disagreement.
Definitely. I found something similar when I was teaching, is that it is not come naturally to them to disagree, for sure. And like you said, within the past 5 years. And it is interesting how your use of the AWARE framework in particular is able to help students come to a place where they can disagree and, talk about things more meaningfully. And it sounds like have more confidence in what they had to say.
Oh, absolutely. The poetry piece, too, was another unexpected. I didn't expect, and maybe this sounds negative, I didn't expect so much talent. My kids really, really surprised me. And some of the students, they just wrote and they kept writing and they kept writing. And first they would just show the writing to me. And then I would say, I think this student would really love to see this poem. I think your peer would just appreciate this. Or, man, this reminds me of something so-and-so wrote. Why don't you share? And it just grew. The more feedback that they got for their ideas, the more eager they became to share those ideas. And it was really nice. One student, one of my ESL students in particular, very, very shy, started writing poems every day and sharing them with her mom, painting pictures for them. It was the confidence of some of the students in particular was remarkable. It's nothing short of remarkable.
Absolutely. That's incredible. That's incredible to hear. How also did art and poetry, so students are writing their own poems, right?
Yes.
Did you have them share with each other and try and take the perspective of the person who is writing the poem? How did that work when it was interacting with others and their poems within the classroom?
My first vision for the project was that students would be writing poetry for each other's art and art for each other's poems. But we actually decided that we wanted to expand that and let students write poems responding to like famous art. So I gave them links to different art museums and things like that. And to get them to practice perspective, they had a choice. They could write as if they were writing to the poem, as if they are in the painting, as if they were the person that painted it, if they were trying to imagine why the person painted it. And I say painting, but we really opened it up. One kid chose a piece of jewelry and wrote a beautiful piece on this why he think this jewelry was created and who it was intended for and who made it. And it was actually a really nice poem because I kept saying painting, painting. And this kid's like, well, I want to write about this. So kids chose all kinds of different things that really let them practice with perspective, thinking about like, well, why was this created? And that was just nice to see. One thing that I wish I had done sooner in the project, and I don't mind admitting it, because I would like people to be able to try these ideas. The kids had a lot of fun. I underestimated the value of the simple forms of poetry. So as a high school teacher, I was thinking, oh, Diamante, that's just 5-line poems that's too low level for these kids. And it was a big mistake. A lot of these kids haven't written poetry since elementary school. And it's sad when you think about it. We get really caught up in the standards and following our curriculum, and there's not a lot of space for creativity. So some of these very, very talented kids, they had not written poems since probably 4th grade, it's sad, but it also makes me grateful that they had the opportunity. But coming back to those simple forms of poetry, you don't need a lot of words to express a complex idea. And those simple forms of poetry, again, gave an entry point for some of those kids that are intimidated from poetry, that are still struggling with language. So that is something that I would do much, much earlier on, is just really not avoid those simple forms of poetry, the concrete poems, the diamantes, all of them. Really give kids lots and lots of choice, and not underestimate the power of some of those simple forms. I got some very simple forms of poetry that really express some complex, beautiful ideas from my kids, and made me realize that I shortchanged those short, simple forms.
Thank you for sharing that. I think you gave your students an incredible opportunity. And I'm so glad that you were able to see that opportunity to be able to help them create poems, be more creative, and give them the space. Because you're right. It is challenging as teachers to find space and to create space, honestly, when we have so many demands on us and on our time. So just kudos to you, Shannon, because it's fantastic.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. And yeah, we all have just more and more demands on our time. And I am happy to say, as fun as this project was, we met lots of standards in ELA, obviously, and we got lots of important practice. Unfortunately, we don't get the test scores until September, so remains to be seen how successful, I guess, it was in that regard. But I know it's absolutely something the students won't forget. And when it comes down to it, we all know that's really the important part, right?
Definitely. So as we're about to close out, I would like to know, what advice would you give to teachers who want to empower more student voices, using your lessons, or potentially adapting them? What are some words of wisdom that you would give to a teacher who wants to do this?
One piece of advice is to incorporate these steps into some online discussions for various reasons. One, if you have been on an online discussion lately, you know the general public could definitely use some practice and some lessons on how to have some appropriate online discussions. All joking aside, students are used to just shouting into the void online and not really engaging in discourse. And to some extent, they carry that into their classroom discussions. Oh, I'm going to answer teacher's question and then I'm finished. So with the online discussions and using Aware, really emphasizing the listening portion. I mean, listening even on an online discussion would mean responding specifically to people's ideas, not just saying, "Oh, that's great, thumbs up." That made a huge difference in not just the online discussions. I saw a lot of progress, but our class discussions as well, because it shifted the focus. They really needed to focus on their peers' ideas and not just stating their opinion and taking a bow, basically. So I was really pleased. And then also the online discussions opened it up for kids that I would not have heard from. As much as we want to encourage kids to speak, we can't force them, and everyone has different comfort levels, and honestly, that's okay. We really want everyone to be able to share. We want everyone to share ideas, whether that's verbally, whether that's on an online forum, as long as people get to share their opinions, have their opinions responded to, and respond to the opinions of others. That's really what is at the essence of what we want. So those online discussions were incredibly valuable. I hope that my students are going to carry those skills. And I think that they are going to carry some of those skills onto their online discussions that they have outside of school. So that would be one piece of advice. The other piece of advice is there are a lot of great poets, a lot of wonderful artists, is think of your categories, your few examples, and turn it over to the kids. And that can be difficult. I think a lot of us in the classroom are control freaks, and I'm not excluding myself, but turning it over to the kids so they can find the piece that speaks to them. Like the boy with the jewelry. I was thinking paintings, maybe sculptures. I wasn't thinking of jewelry or clothes or beadwork or just other art forms. It just wasn't part of my radar. So finding some good, reliable sites that let kids explore the poems and explore the art, and teaching them how to navigate those. That would be another piece of advice, is giving some control over to the kids.
I think that's incredible, especially the idea of, as your students are being open to, new poems and things like that, you are being open to their ideas and what they connect with. So, it's almost a reciprocal relationship, whereas you are teaching students to be aware, but also almost as a teacher, your students are teaching you to be more aware, right?
Absolutely. I was glad I got out of my comfort zone with both the poetry and the art, and was comfortable admitting to my students, hey, this isn't my thing. What does this art mean? I'm not good at this kind of thing. That was another part of the unit that was fun, is a student I have that struggles with reading, but is an artist. Actually had entered some competitions and was a very talented artist. I let her take over the class when we were analyzing art, and that was a huge confidence builder because she never got to be the leader in an ELA class as someone who struggled with reading. But anytime we were analyzing art, she was really good at it. She had excellent ideas. She knew how to lead the discussion. She knew how to take over. And I'm just really glad we had that opportunity, and I know that it was good for her.
I can imagine that was an incredible opportunity for her. Shannon, if a teacher wants to start using poetry and art to empower student voices and to set the stage for civil discourse at the beginning of the year, what would you suggest is the first step that they should take?
The first step is really to introduce the steps and purpose of AWARE, and then to plan a larger unit or lessons. It might sound boring, but start with the standards. I mean, that really is the building block for most good instruction, is start with your standards, because that's going to drive the rest of your instruction. And AWARE is adaptable to a lot of different grade levels and really across content. So, for example, you might not analyze art. If you're in a history class, it might be political cartoons. Kids really need that practice. If you're in a math class, they might need to really talk about charts and graphs and what they notice about charts and graphs. So it might be a different type of visual, but you're still going through the steps. So the first step is create a visual that students can refer to for AWARE. whatever works for you, whether that's a slide that you can refer to, whether that's a poster you hang in the room, whether that is a handout that students keep in their notebooks, some kind of visual that makes it easy for students to continually refer to the steps of AWARE. For the planning process, start with your standards. Think about which ones you want to emphasize and let that really drive your instruction. The next thing, and this research might be really old at this point, but still relevant in my opinion, Gardner's 7 intelligences. Kids benefit from different modalities, different mediums. Some kids are going to respond well to the visuals. One thing we didn't talk about much, I also use speeches in this unit. I used TED Talks and other types of speeches. That worked great for some kids. Some kids are going to find their voice with poetry and art, and some are going to find it by making their own podcasts, for example. So it's really about creating a lot of opportunity for the input, I would say, and the output of students so that they're taking in information in a variety of ways, and they also have a variety of ways to express their understanding of that information.
I think that's great advice. And, honestly, really hits on those standards that we forget sometimes in ELA of speaking and listening. We just kind of gloss over it because many times as English teachers, in my experience, we tend to focus on reading and writing at the expense of speaking and listening. But they're all, just like you said, they are ways of taking in information and then also expressing information.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned it. Speaking and listening are just so often overlooked. And as we look at what's happening just out in the world, I guess I would say, people don't magically know how to speak and listen appropriately without practice, without instruction, just like any others. It needs to be practiced. And it's so useful that we really do need to create those opportunities for students for speaking and listening. Speaking and listening can also be hard to assess. And that is one thing I like about the online discussions. And the AWARE framework is being able to assess the notes from the discussion. It does make it, because it is hard to monitor small group discussions, because I'm a teacher. I know the reality. There's 30 kids in the room and they're all speaking, and you're trying to facilitate and record data, and that's just not realistic for most of us. So being able to go back to the AWARE and what they put on AWARE made it much easier for me to assess their speaking and listening. And even an online discussion, if you look at the speaking and listening standards, they are meeting the same standards of sharing opinions, responding to others, if it is structured appropriately. So you can assess those speaking and listening standards from an online discussion.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that you just provided a lot of great advice for teachers who are looking to meet those standards a little bit more of speaking and listening.
Well, and we also talked about how creativity can often get pushed aside as we're trying to meet the standards. And this did offer students some space for higher order thinking, as well as creativity and voice.
Absolutely. Which is where we want to get them. That higher order level of thinking, right? And that creativity. That's where we want students to be.
Absolutely.
Finally, I have one more question for you, Shannon. And thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. What was the most surprising thing you discovered about teaching civil discourse once you started integrating art, poetry, and in intertwining civil discourse into your classroom curriculum?
I didn't expect the level of engagement, to be honest, because 10th graders are a tough crowd. Anyone who's worked with sophomores know that they are not an easy group. So I didn't think that they were going to be as excited about the ideas of civil discourse. When I showed the first slam poetry video and a couple of students said, "Oh, that went hard, miss," I knew that I was onto something, that I was on track for a good idea. But, I shouldn't be surprised that students care about civil discourse, because everyone wants to be respected and everyone wants to be heard. And students are no different. They're just used to being treated like their voices don't matter. And it does take a lot of hard work unlearn that mindset. And so one thing I think that I hope has been emphasized is this is not quick. This isn't easy. This isn't a few lessons. This is really meaningful work that takes repeated practice before it starts to go well. Those first few lessons are going to be rough, and it's okay. It is worth the effort. But yeah, it does take hard work to unlearn that mindset that their voices don't matter. So not every student is going to find their voice with art or with poetry, but every student can engage in high-level academic discussions.
Well, Shannon, you are doing some meaningful work, and I thank you so much for joining me today on the Teacher Sphere. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks, Kobe.
Shannon's journey shows that you don't need to be an expert in poetry or art to transform your classroom into a place where civil discourse thrives. Her biggest discovery? Sometimes our students are just waiting for permission to surprise us. Are you ready to try this? Start with the AWARE framework and one piece of visual art. See what your students notice before they make any judgments. All the resources Shannon mentioned are waiting for you in our show notes. Thank you for listening to the Teacher Sphere. Special thanks to our producers and musicians. If this episode resonated with you, share it with a fellow educator. Until next time, keep empowering your students' voices and preparing them for conversations that matter.